I think moms need to hear that your kids aren't going to grow up to be freaks. Oh, I mean, they might if you're a freak, but not if they do, it won't be because of homeschooling.
Hey everyone, this is Yvette Hampton. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. I am thrilled that you are back with us today. I hope you're having a great day, whatever you're doing today. I'm sure you've got little ones tugging at your toes and pulling on your shirt, asking for a snack, or whatever it is that you've got going on right now. I am grateful that you are listening to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast today because we have a great guest with us again this week, as we always do. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, CTC Math. They are a fantastic online math curriculum program. If you are looking for an online math program, check them out, ctcmath.com. You can try it for free. The first several lessons you can try for free, see if it works for you and your family, ctcmath.com. Well, I want to introduce you guys to my friend, Steve Lambert. Steve and I met several years ago at a Teach Them Diligently homeschool convention in Nashville, Tennessee. And if you listen to Heidi St. John, if you listen to her podcast, you've probably heard Steve on there. He and his wife, Jane, are really good friends with the St. Johns. And so this is the first time Steve's been on the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast, and I'm really honored to have him on. He has been part of the homeschool world for a really long time. And guys, when I say a really long time, I mean since I was like 7. That's a long time. That's like 40 years, which is awesome. He and his wife began homeschooling in 1981. And I just find it incredible that God has used him and his family in amazing ways. And so I'm excited to introduce him to you. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much, Yvette. It's great to be here with you today.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's kind of funny how you ended up coming on because we are starting to do this series. It's called the Homeschool Survival Series. And I was wanting somebody to come on to talk about unit studies. And I thought, well, of course, the best person to talk about unit studies would be Jane Lambert, who wrote 5 in a Row, the curriculum 5 in a Row. And so I contacted Steve and I said, hey, can we get Jane on the podcast? And he said, well, you know, she's great behind the pen, but she doesn't really love being in front of the camera. Let us think about it and pray about it. Well, that led to getting into a deeper conversation with Steve. And he just said, you know, I'd be happy to bring some encouragement as a veteran homeschool dad to your audience. And as we started this discussion on it, I was like, this is amazing. We need to hear this message. And so as a veteran homeschool dad who's been at this for 40 some years, introduce us first to your family. And then I would love to know how you got involved in homeschooling back in 1981.
Yeah, it was a whole different experience back then. Yvette, to my knowledge, we never met a homeschool family. I never heard of homeschooling. I didn't know homeschooling was even an option. And somehow my wife heard about it. Jane, I don't know where she came across the concept, and she said, "What would you think?" Now, this conversation ought to sound familiar because I think many of your listeners and your viewers have had this same conversation. She said, "What would you think? I mean, just hypothetically now, what would you think if we were to take the kids out of school and teach them at home?" And that's how it begins for most of us. And it's usually prompted by the Holy Spirit, and things that we swore we'd never do, we suddenly find ourselves exploring. And so my first question was, is that even legal? And my
Right.
second question was, I didn't know the word socialization back then. Nobody taught me that word. So I said, how will my kids have friends if they're not in school? And so we talked about it and I prayed about it. And I felt like the Lord said to me, you want your kids to have friends? I said, yes. And he said, and you're convinced that being around lots of other kids makes friendship. And I said, right. And I felt like kind of, not audibly, you know what I mean? I just felt
Mm-hmm.
like the Lord
Sure.
said to me, I can hear the prayers tonight of thousands of people who are surrounded by people, but who are so lonely tonight that they're considering suicide.
Mm.
Friendship is not a result of being around people. If you want friends for your children, ask me. I'll send them friends. Friendship is a gift from God. And so we began that journey. They've been in public school. Our oldest daughter, not our youngest, our oldest had been in public school for a year, then a private Christian school for a year. And then we made the decision to begin homeschooling. And so that was in 1981. And within a few months, I'd be less than honest if I didn't tell you. And Jane always kind of cringes when I say this, but it's true. And she knows it's true. within a few months, I'd come home from work and I'd find Jane in her room crying. I'd find our daughter in her room crying. And Jane said after a while, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. I never wanted to be at war with my kids. And I think we should maybe just throw ourselves in the mercy of the school board and re-enroll them. But as she prayed about it, she felt like the Lord said, why don't you read to your kids? And she said, oh, I do, but how do I teach them? And he said, why don't you read to them? And she said, well, I do. We read aloud a lot, but how do I teach them? And he said, why don't you read to them? And so on that note, she kind of changed everything she was doing, because we'd found used textbooks at garage sales and old history. I think the first history book we ever found was published in 1943, and we got to the end of it, and it didn't tell who won World War II. And so we were kind of distressed by that. But so she said,
do you know now?
Yeah, I do know now. I do know now. So she kind of set that all aside, except for math and spelling, and she began reading. And out of the reading time came all sorts of joyous discoveries, because within the pages of books are treasures about history and about personalities and about courage and about dealing with our fears and about geography and about foreign culture and food and music. And so together they began exploring. And out of that, oddly, several years later, as our kids began to grow, several girlfriends came to Jane and said, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I find myself in my room crying most days and my kids in their room crying, and you seem to have a great experience. What do you do? And she said, well, you just read to them. And they said, what do you mean read to them? And so she said, well, you read and you talk about what's in the books. And they said, well, I don't get it. And so she wrote, as a gift to some girlfriends, some lesson plans for some of her favorite early childhood books, and said, here's some things you could talk about, and here's some things you could do, and meals you could cook, and places you could explore. And that became the very first incarnation of what's now known as 5 in a row unit studies, which have been used, I think, by 600,000 or 700,000 children over the last 30 years in about, 60 different countries. But it all began really kind of at the bedside Bible college of homeschooling, because, and I think this is important, because there weren't any choices back then. There wasn't any homeschool curriculum to choose from. Textbook publishers wouldn't sell. We contacted several Christian textbook publishers and they wouldn't sell to us because, and this is my surmising between the lines, but I think because Christian schools said, if you sell to homeschoolers, then they don't need us and we will stop using your curriculum. So they refused to sell to individuals. But as time went by, the industry grew. And now, I'm proud to be part of the industry that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. But I think it's actually harder for new homeschoolers today than it was then, because then all we knew was the Lord had told us to do it. And so we had to figure it out. And today, I think if you walk into a typical homeschool convention and you see 600 vendors with over 100 math programs and over 100 phonics programs and over 100 history programs, it's just pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I will sometimes say to Jane, what would you do if you walked in today as a brand new first-time homeschooler? And she said, I think I'd turn around and walk back out again. But over the years, we've watched it grow. And now we're in the third generation because our kids are grown. My daughters are now 40. Well, I'm not going to say it, but they're well into their 40s. And so my oldest grandchild's making plans for an upcoming wedding. And so I have 7 grandkids from age 7 to age 22, and they've all been homeschooled. And so I think moms need to hear that your kids aren't going to grow up to be freaks. Oh, they might if you're a freak, but not if they do, it won't be because of homeschooling. And so we're now seeing third generation homeschoolers, and we know now thousands and thousands of them besides our own children, our grandchildren, and discover that they're leaders in their community. They find their place within the community. They develop their gift set through the medium of homeschooling and the opportunities that are abundant there that are missing in a classroom setting, where they have time to pursue their gifts and their interests. And wherever they seem to go, they immediately, almost without exception, it seems, to become leaders in whatever community they find themselves in. And I think parents who are just starting this journey need to know that that's the outcome. I read a survey not too long ago about a small private college, I think in the Carolinas, if I recall, and they had 3,000 students, and of the 3,000 students, they had 90 who had been homeschooled. So 3%. But of the 12 elected leadership positions among the student body, so advisor to the dean, senior class president, advisor to whatever,
Mhm.
11 of the 12 were homeschool students,
Oh, wow.
recognized by their peers as being leaders in the university community. So it's scary. I mean, this is a scary thing. If you foul this up, your kids and your grandkids are going to come home and live with you forever because they're never going to be able to get a job. So we're frightened when we start this journey, but it's now a well-traveled path with lots of proven results. And our family is just one of millions of families that have seen the fruit that grows. And the fruit that grows from homeschooling is sweet.
Yeah.
And especially when it's a decision born out of faith. Decisions born out of faith bear sweet fruit. Decisions born out of fear, not so much sometimes. Sometimes that can be bitter. So we encourage people, don't choose homeschooling because you're afraid of violence in the classroom or because you're afraid of godlessness in the schools, because all those are real. I mean,
Right.
those are things to be concerned about. But the reason to choose homeschooling is because the Lord's put that desire in your heart, and you move forward by faith, going, you know what, Lord, I don't have all the answers, but I'm trusting that you knew I was terrible at spelling when I was in school, and you've got a plan, and I'm trusting you for that.
Yeah. Amen. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back.
What we do at IEW is break through the noise of the grammar and the writing prompts, and we say, this is what you do, step by step. And I've witnessed it over and over again, both watching Andrew teach and hearing from parents, this is the best writing program. We've made it so easy and made it really affordable. So any mom can teach writing to their children using our course, and we guarantee it.
To try 3 weeks of free lessons, visit IEW.com. We are back with Steve. And, it's so interesting to think back to those years. Tell us kind of how you've seen the transition of homeschooling. And you talked about curriculum, of course, and how there was not a lot available. But what have you seen? How have you seen culture shift from those years in the early 80s into the 90s, into the 2000s, and now we're in 2022, which is so crazy to think that we're this far ahead of it now. How have you seen things shift? Because you've been doing this for quite some time.
Yeah, we have. And we were first homeschoolers for about 14 years before we became involved in the industry. And we've been in the industry now for 28 years or 27 years. And it's interesting because when we started, we literally hid in the house and during school hours. And we actually got a knock at the door from Department of Family Services. And we think we know who, a relative of mine who has since passed away, I believe, with the best of intentions, contacted social services and said, this family is neglecting their children and not letting them be in school. And so they came, they had to see our children, make sure they weren't abused or bruised or whatever. And they referred us to the school district where we lived. And so I ended up getting summoned to the superintendent's office of this suburban 4A school district. And we hired an attorney because at that point in time, there was a prosecutorial atmosphere about
Sure.
homeschooling, and we'd heard frightening stories. So we hired an attorney. We met. Ultimately, he gave us his blessing. He said, I'm not going to cause you any trouble. And in fact, we had test results that indicated our children were actually testing better under our care than they had with the same test when they were in public school, or the oldest. But the funny part of that story was he said to me, I think you're making a serious mistake. And he was then about my age now. He was probably in his late 60s when I was in my 30s. And he said, I have a doctorate in public education. And he said, I believe that you're making a serious mistake that you'll regret in years to come. But we're not going to hold it against you. And, appreciate you coming and spending time with us today. Well, the strange part was about 3 months later, I get a phone call from the superintendent. And I thought, oh, boy, what's this about? And he said, Mr. Lambert, can I talk with you frankly? And I said, sure. And he said, I don't know that you're aware of this, probably not. But he said, we're having some problems in public education. I said, no.
You
Really?
don't say.
I'm shocked, doctor. he said, no, it's true. He said, test scores continue to decline. He said, student satisfaction is declining, parents' involvement is declining, teacher satisfaction is declining. So he said, I put together a blue ribbon panel this summer to meet for 6 weeks to talk about what can we do to revamp public education. And you have a very unique perspective. I wonder if you'd be a part of our board.
Wow.
And I said, okay, kind of hesitantly. So I showed up that night, and there were about 15 people there. And as they introduced themselves, each one had a long string of letters after their names. And this was Dr. So-and-so, whose doctorate was in curriculum development, and Dr. So-and-so in educational testing, Dr. So-and-so in literacy. And I said, hi, I'm Steve, and I'm a homeschool dad. And every head in that room revolved about 180 degrees to look at me. I was sitting towards the back because at that point in history, nobody had ever actually seen a homeschool parent and lived to tell about it back in 1981. So the fellow begins, he goes to the whiteboard and he takes his marker and he begins to write in the whiteboard. He goes, we could all talk about a lot of things that are wrong with public education, but he goes, let's start with something positive. Let's start with what we know is right and true about public education. Number one, the responsibility for educating children rests with the state.
Ooh.
And I raised my hand. He goes, yes, Mr. Lambert. And I said, that's not right. He goes, what do you mean that's not right? I said, the responsibility for educating children rests with the parents, and the only reason the state has any input is because the parents have abdicated part of that responsibility and turned it over to the state. And he said, well, let's take a brief recess. And so they didn't really want to hear what I had to say, and so I didn't attend the rest of those meetings. But we're now at a place where colleges and universities are aggressively recruiting homeschool students.
Right.
It's gone from being unknown or even unthinkable, unimaginable, to a mainstream interest. And now, when my daughter was the first, this was an interesting story to me. My oldest daughter was the first homeschool student to go to a large community college in 1990, I believe it was. She was only 16. She enrolled at 15, and she started her first class a week after her 16th birthday. And when she went through the enrollment process, they gave her standardized testing on language arts and math and blah, 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 and they placed her. But the counselor said, you know, I see here in your transcript that you're a homeschool student. He said, I don't know we've ever had a homeschool student before. He said, so what was that like? And she said, well, you know, it's different, but, you know, it's been good for me. So she goes to her first day of class, and it's a public speaking class. And everybody, it was a prereq for every incoming freshman, whether, you know, regardless. And I think there were 31,000 students in this community college at that time.
Oh, wow.
And she was the first and probably the youngest homeschool student and the youngest student on the campus. So her first day of class, she's horrified to realize that her public speaking teacher is the guy who did her admissions counseling. He wasn't really a counselor. He was a public speaking teacher. So at that, he said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, there's no way to teach public speaking. It's just a matter of getting used to the concept of standing in front of an audience. So beginning Monday, I want each of you to be prepared to give a 6-minute speech on military involvement and nation building in foreign countries. Except for you, Ms. Lambert. And I'd like for you to give a 6-minute speech on what it was like to be homeschooled. And she just about sunk under her desk in embarrassment because she didn't really want anybody to know at that time, at least her fellow students. And she said, Dad, she said, what am I going to do? And I said, well, you're going to get up and tell them about it. And so she said, as far as I can tell, she said there were returning empty nesters coming back to college. There were GIs coming back on the GI Bill that had been in Afghanistan or Iraq. She said there were jocks there who were not really interested in academics. They were there to play sports. There were cheerleaders. There were pre-med students. But everybody had to take this class. And so she said, I got up and I told my story. And she said, as far as I can tell, every person in that class before the semester was over found me somewhere on the campus, in the quadrangle, in the library, the dining room, the parking lot, to say, I'm so jealous that your parents were involved in your education. I wish mine had been. But she said, here's the one that killed me, Dad. She said, the most prestigious school district in our area, and we live here in the Midwest, is a 5A school district, and that particular school, I think, has around 4,000 students in the high school. And she said, a young girl came up to me in that class, and she said, can I talk to you a minute? And she said, sure. And she said, when I started high school 4 years ago, my dream was to become valedictorian of my graduating class. She said, I've never been to a sleepover. I've never been on a date. She said, I've never been at a roller skating party or anything else. I've studied for 4 years. She said, there was this guy, and he and I were neck and neck for 4 years in our scores. And she said, it's not enough to have a 4.0. She said, I was in all AP classes. So she said, it came down to the last test of the last class of the last semester of our senior year. And I beat him by 2 questions on one of the final exams. And she said, so last May, she said, I was valedictorian. My dream came true. And she said, I stood on the football field in front of 4,000 of my peers, parents, community leaders, pastors, government leaders in our community, and I delivered the commencement address. And she said, both of my parents were too busy to attend.
Oh, wow.
I wish my parents had cared as much about me as your parents cared about you. And that's what's changed. It's gone from being anathema to being mainstream course, that even kids who may mock it or make fun of it now are somewhat envious. And frankly, I think a lot of parents who poo-poo it are envious, and they wish they had the courage to teach their kids like today's homeschool parents.
Wow. What an incredible story. That is amazing. It's incredible to see what the Lord has done through your kids, and to imagine all of the kids who really do wish that they had been in the shoes of children like yours, especially back in those days, and it was so foreign. It's still so foreign for so many people, even though now it's so much more widely accepted. But I still think people are kind of like, homeschooling, what does that even look like? And so, we are so thankful to have the freedom that we have today, because people like you have fought for our freedoms, but also to have the ability to just open up people's eyes and help them to see that homeschooling is such a blessing, not just for the parents, but especially for the kids and for their futures. So we are out of time. We're going to come back on Wednesday and continue this conversation. I'm loving talking to you. Thank you so much, Steve. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, they can learn about our curriculum at www.5inarow.com, all spelled out like one word, FIVEINAROW, 5inarow.com.
Okay. We will put links to that in the show notes. Thank you guys so much for listening today. Please be sure to share this with a friend. I know you've got a friend who needs to be encouraged. Just hit that share link and send it off to them. We would appreciate that so much. And if you have not yet seen the movie Schoolhouse Rocked, go to schoolhouserocked.com. Steve has seen it. He loved it. Yep. Actually, let me just say really quickly, this is kind of funny. Steve was the first person who said to us, you've got to get Heidi St. John in this movie. And this was years ago. I mean, this was probably just a couple months into our filming of the movie. And he said, you've got to get Heidi St. John in this film. And I was like, oh, okay. And so we did. And actually, I shouldn't say you were the first one. Andrew Pudaw was the first one who said that. And then you sent a message shortly after that. And you said, you've got to get Heidi St. John in this film. And you were really good friends with her as well. And so we're like, okay, God must really want Heidi St. John in this movie. So she's in it. If you haven't seen it, go to schoolhouserocked.com and you can see who Heidi St. John is.
Great movie.
And yeah, thank you. All by God's grace. And so many other great cast members that the Lord has brought to us, because he's a faithful God. Thank you guys. We'll see you back here on Wednesday. Have a great day. Bye.
We know that we are called to put on the armor of God. So we are teaching our children to be salt and light in the world, but we're not putting our children out onto the front lines of the battle until they're ready.
We need to look at our children and realize they can't be salt till they've got salt. And if the salt's contaminated, then it's no good for anything. That's what the scripture says. And they have to remember that because of our sin nature, it's more likely the culture will influence our children rather than the children the culture. So how can we send them out into the world until we have prepared them? You don't send a knight out to fight until he's prepared with all the armor that he needs.
So the front lines really in the culture right now, what is up for grabs in the culture? It's truth. Truth is what's in the crosshairs right now. And until our children are steeped in truth, until they know truth, until they can defend truth, we would never put a defenseless child out on the front lines. And education is a frontline battle. It is not a sideline battle. It's not something that's happening in the periphery of our lives. This is happening in the culture in real time. This is the front line of the culture. This is where the battle for truth is being fought, and it is where the battle for truth is being lost. And so we do not want our children out on the front lines. We are training our children to go out onto the front lines. And so to me, when we talk about salt and light, I say, let's put the people out on the front lines who are trained and ready for battle.